Hello everyone, and welcome to the start of my little series all about the Iranian material evidence of the new Persian aspect of the Ancient History GCSE. I'm going to call it a teaching guide of some sort. So before I get started with a quick look at the overall course, I just want to say that my videos will not be covering everything you as students and teachers will need to know. Rather, I will be focusing on the 4 Achaemenid kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius and Xerxes, looking at them solely through archaeological evidence. I do this because the classical sources are well taught and have been for years, but unfortunately sometimes the Iranian evidence can be overlooked. So here's the overview of the part of the course I will be talking about in these videos. So we're going to be looking at component 1, which is Greece and Persia, and here's the content overview. So the compulsory period study focuses on the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, Darius I, and Xerxes I. Students develop their understanding for the unfolding narrative of substantial developments and issues associated with this period. And after this, you have your one-depth study from free on offer, but that's not going to be focusing in these videos at all. So we're just looking at the period study. So this is worth 27.5% of the GCSE, and it's 60 marks, 30 marks on your assessment objective 1, 15 on AO2 and 10 marks on AO3, and all of this is written in the GCSE specification, but I've got it all down for you here just in case you weren't prepared. Let's have a quick look at those assessment objectives. So AO1 is to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the key features and characteristics of the historical period studied. AO2 to analyse and explain historical events and historical periods to arrive at substantial judgments. AO3 use, analyse and evaluate ancient sources within their historical context to make judgments and draw conclusions about historical events and period studies, and how the portrayal of events by ancient writers and sources relates to the historical context in which they were written and produced. So your assessment objectives are key to getting your marks in your essays in your exam. Your teachers will be going on about these, and you need to make sure that you're hitting them so you can get all your full marks, especially AO1, as that is where most of the marks are held, but you'll be getting all of that knowledge in your class. So what I'm really focusing on in these videos is that assessment objective 3, which is to use the ancient sources, and I'm specifically looking at those Iranian sources, because I have to say in the textbook they have a lot of the classical texts, but not a lot written on the archaeological evidence. This is the OCR teaching guide that I have taken quite a few of my sources from, and it can be found online. However, not all of them, because I think there are some very significant examples which it doesn't mention. So going into the reason why we're all here, let's just start with our sources of King Cyrus the Great. Here we have Cyrus II of Persia, commonly known as Cyrus the Great, and also Cyrus the Elder by the Greeks, and he's the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, which is the first Persian Empire. Under his rule, the empire embraced all the previous civilized states of the ancient Near East, and it expanded vastly and eventually conquered most of the Western Asia and much of Central Asia. So there's quite a lot of material evidence for Cyrus, but I've picked 3 aspects which I think are very interesting and significant. A lot of them come from the sites of Pasgard, which is where this relief on the screen is from here. And now if we look at the map that is showing the empire by sort of like the end of Cyrus the Great's reign, so we can see where he conquers first. So obviously he starts in Persia here, and he moves slowly into Media, and then eventually he'll make his way all the way up to Lydia around here. One of the most key pieces of material evidence for Cyrus, and therefore the one I'm going to be starting with, is the Cyrus cylinder. It's very famous, so I hope most of you will know it already, but I'm just going to go into further detail on it. So the textbook which accompanies this part of the course, which is over on the right here, describes it as a Babylonian account of the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus in 539 BC, and his restoration of statues to their respective temples that had been removed by the previous king Narbonidus. So the cylindrical form is very typical of royal inscriptions of the late Babylonian period. It's incomplete and the British Museum piece is damaged. So here we go, we can see that damage here really closely, but we've still managed to be able to read a lot of the cylinder. So it was found deposited in the foundation of the city walls at Babylon, and it was intended to be devoted to the gods. As this evidence now belongs to the British Museum, I think it was useful to go onto the website to see what the curator says. So they've written that the whole document is written from a purely Babylonian point of view in traditional Babylonian terms. It's been suggested that its author took the Ashurbanipal inscription as his literary model, Ashurbanipal being a great Assyrian king who were the people who ruled Iran before the Achaemenids. And I think it's interesting that on the website the museum picks up on Cyrus's use of Marduk in his propaganda. So there's no acknowledgement that Cyrus himself worshipped the Iranian god Ahura Mazda, who goes on to play a prominent role of the propaganda of later kings such as Darius, but instead he is the tool of Marduk, the Babylonian god. So it's just as in the book of Ezra, he's presented as the servant of the God of Israel. So the textbook condenses all of this by just saying that the Cyrus cylinder states that the Babylonian god Marduk requested Cyrus become the king because the barbarian king Nabonidus didn't respect local deities and was treating his subjects badly. In terms of the content in which this piece relates to within the course, it's key at demonstrating themes that will come up in your exams, such as Cyrus's treatment of other peoples and cultures, and as well as how he's using propaganda and religion to justify his conquests. So I'm now going to jump into a little passage analysis, and I've got lines 8 to 12 of the cylinder here to demonstrate how you can use the evidence for your exams and the sort of stuff that you should be able to pick out from Cyrus's words. So here we go. This passage is about the previous king Nabonidus and how he turns his back on Marduk and all the impious evil deeds that he supposedly does. So he stopped the regular offerings he placed in the cult centres. The worship of Marduk, king of the gods, he removed from his mind. He repeatedly did that which was bad for his city. Daily he destroyed all his subjects with an unending yoke. In response to their laments, the Enlil of the gods grew very angry. Their territory, the gods who lived in them left their dwelling places. Despite his anger, he brought them into Babylon, Marduk to all the places whose dwelling places were in ruins, and the inhabitants of Sumer and Akkad who had become like corpses. He turned his mind and he became merciful. He searched through all the countries, examined them. He sought a just ruler to suit his heart. He took him by the hand, Cyrus, king of Anshan. He called for dominion over the totality. He named his name. So before I start, I just want to say there's some great analysis of passages like this in Amelie Kurtz's source book, which I will be listing in my bibliography at the end of this video. I would strongly recommend that teachers and students use her work. So this particular passage is important because it highlights a part of Cyrus's propaganda, his portrayal of the previous king Nabonidus as being impious, and Cyrus himself being the chosen ruler of Marduk. So he is portraying the people underneath Nabonidus as being oppressed when he uses language such as like corpses and unending yoke up here. And by doing all this, Cyrus in comparison becomes their liberator. This is an extremely good passage when it comes to applying evidence to the exam questions, as it can be applied to show Cyrus's supposed motives behind his conquest and how he uses propaganda to become known as that liberator. So the textbook asks the class to debate how significant Cyrus's conquest of Babylon might have been for the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So this passage indicates that he probably improves it. Marduk supposedly went through all the countries to find him, and therefore he must have been special enough to help the people. So it's analysis of real Iranian evidence like this in exams, which will enable you as students to pick up those AO3 marks, which can be really, really difficult to get. So I think this should be stressed. So there's an example question which I found in the textbook, which asks you to look at passages and use your own knowledge to talk about what we can learn about Cyrus's policy towards foreign religions. And I would say if the Cyrus cylinder is not the passage, then you should really be using it for questions like that. Not just this passage, but throughout the whole thing, it shows how Cyrus was sort of very inclusive of the previous Babylonian religions that had been there, and he even goes on to sort of, in the book of Ezra, free the Jews and things like that. So that's quite positive towards his sort of foreign relations, which you can all use in your essay questions. So the next object we're going to be looking at is the Nabonidus stele. After just looking at the account of Babylon from Cyrus's perspective, it makes sense to see how else Nabonidus has been represented. So this object cannot be found in the OCR teaching guide or textbook, but I personally wanted to include it in this collection of material evidence because of the significance of the alternate perspective it provides. So just like the Cyrus cylinder, it belongs to the British Museum, So once again, I'm going to introduce it from their perspective. So this is a basalt stele that was excavated at Babylon. It's rounded at the top and bearing on its obverse the figure of a king and the astronomical symbols. So we have the star of Ishtar here, we have the sun disk of Shamash here, and we have the moon of the god Sin. And notice that the moon is bigger to show its supremacy. And on the other side, we have the king wearing a canonical headdress and a fringed garment which reaches to his ankles. In his right hand, which is raised, he holds a short cylindrical object, and with his left hand he supports a ringed staff or standard. Now, a portion of the text which was engraved on the right-hand side of the stele has been partially rubbed down, but the characters may still be deciphered. It's an inscription of a Babylonian king and recounts how the gods put an end to a period of drought in consequence of the king's good deeds. So the lines on the inscription on the right-hand side extend from the edge of the obverse to the edges of the reverse across its chamfered face. So here we have that inscription on the right part, and it reads, "My good deeds he beheld with joy, and he gave me length of days. At the word of the gods, the king of the gods, Adad, brought back the rain, and Ea opened his springs. Wealth, prosperity, and abundance he established in my land. 1 gur and 90 kar of grain was sold for 1 shekel of silver. 1 gur and 210 kar of dates for 1 shekel of silver. 110 kar of sesame seed for 1 shekel of silver. 30 kar of oil for 1 shekel of silver. 5 mehens of wool for 1 shekel of silver. 1 meheh for 1 shekel of silver. The tops of the mountains in my land he filled with vines. 30 kar of wine for 1 shekel of silver was the price current in my land. Fullness and abundance in my land he established. Of Akkad the work of the gods he crossed. The mighty and the king of the gods there was." And then we lose sort of the rest of the inscription from there. So Nabonidus is listing all that the gods did and the prosperity he brought to the land. This is a stark contrast to the description and language Cyrus has used in his account. So Nabonidus was the last Neo-Babylonian ruler, and this stele is showing his devotion to Sin the moon god, who he saw as supreme. He downgraded the other gods, which really caused the most offence, and I would say Cyrus can be said to have used this to his advantage. Scholar Bulow, after studying many other Nabonidus stelae, said Nabonidus, while appealing to deeply entrenched Babylonian traditions, was ultimately presenting himself as a religious leader and a teacher of wisdom. This was the aspect that I would say caused the greatest offence, but it seemed he never meant to oppress through this. So ultimately, I decided to put this piece in for both teachers and students to have a look at, because I think it really helps with that AO3 understanding. That's the analysis and evaluating ancient sources within their historical context to make judgments. So with this source, you're getting the opposite view to the Cyrus cylinder, which will enable students to make their own judgments on key themes such as how beneficial Cyrus was to Babylon, and also what the motives behind his campaigns were. When I looked at these sources, I personally see Cyrus using the bad reputation of a previous king for his own benefit. He chooses to use the Babylonian god Marduk to contrast against Nabonidus' shunning and newfound love of the moon god Sin. I think when looking at both of these sources, you as teachers and students then need to formulate your own opinions, like based around who made them, and that's what's going to really take you to the next level in your essays and hit those hard to get AO3 marks. So the final piece of Iranian evidence I'm going to be looking at in this video is Cyrus's tomb. So I've chosen this because I thought we could reflect on Cyrus's legacy, as well as looking at a beautiful piece of Persian architecture. So before properly starting, I want to point both students and teachers in the direction of Livius. This is www.livius.org, which I've also screenshotted here for you. And now Livius comes strongly recommended by the OCR Teaching Guide, and I would say it's a great source when it comes to looking at sites such as Pasargadae, which we're about to get stuck into now, but also Persepolis, which will heavily feature in my later videos. I think it gives lots of detail on what can be found at each site, as well as touching on common ecumenative themes and motifs, and this will give students the basic understanding and content to hit their AO1 marks, which they can then expand on with their own analysis and judgments. So now, looking at Cyrus's tomb. The OCR Teaching Guide lists the tomb to demonstrate Persian culture, the personality and priorities of Cyrus, and the nature of evidence for his death. So the tomb dates back to 559 to 529 BC, which places it around the estimated period of Cyrus's death. The most extensive description of the tomb is based on a lost account by Aristobulus, the supposed repairer of Cyrus's tomb, who accompanied Alexander the Great on his eastern campaign in the late 4th century BC, and these details can then be found in the Anabasis of Arrian. So Arrian reads, "The base of the monument was rectangular, built of stone slabs cut square, and on top was a roof chamber, also built of stone, with access through a doorway so narrow that only one man at a time, and a little one at that, could manage with great difficulty, painfully, to squeeze himself through. Inside the chamber there was a golden coffin containing Cyrus's body, and a great divan with feet of hammered gold, spread with covers of some thick, brightly coloured material, with a Babylonian rug on top." And this is taken from Book 6, line 29. So Amelie Kurt, in her source book that I mentioned earlier, says that the tomb of Cyrus matches well with the description given by Arrian. The step platform on which the small gabled chamber stands is 6.5 metres high. The total height from ground level to the top of the roof is 12 metres, and above the entrance traces of a delicately carved rosette were found. Although the building bears no inscription, the masonry technique helps date it to the reign of Cyrus, and as you can see in the photos here, I've got examples of those very large steps and that tiny doorway from Arrian. Cyrus is believed to have been buried in a gold sarcophagus, and the gardens nearby played an important feature. Gardens in Persia were key as they represent a kind of paradise. Lots of ancient kings also used the plants of their gardens to signify their control over the empires. Different flowers represented the different territories they controlled. The monument was said to be located in a grassy meadow with a number of trees around it. The textbook asks the question of thinking about how art and architecture are important for a king to promote a political or social message. Taking into consideration the shape of Cyrus's tomb and the links to his nomadic heritage, so we also see here that the top of the roof is shaped like a stable, and you can see that there are hidden messages in Persian gardens when thinking about this question. So although now it's reported that there's no inscription on the tomb, Strabo said there used to be one, and it reads, "Passer-by, I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire and was king of Asia. Grudge me not therefore this monument." And there's another variation that exists in Persia the Immortal Kingdom, which reads, "O man, whoever thou art, from wheresoever thou comest, for I know you shall come. I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Grudge me not therefore this little earth that covers my body." And although this seems fairly implausible to have been actual inscription, it's still interesting to see how the classical sources view Cyrus. They treat him in a generally positive light and are said to have treated his tomb with respect. I think that's something to take into consideration when you think about who Cyrus was. And finally, to end, this is my bibliography, so it contains the sources that I use. So of course we've got the textbook on there and the teaching guide, and I've got all the web links to Livius and the British Museum on all the artefacts, and there's the Kurt sourcebook listed at the bottom, which I strongly recommend you have a read of.